The valley lay in a fold of the Missouri Ozarks, a place where mornings opened with the hiss of mist on the river and evenings closed with the crackle of cicadas in the brush. In the year 1912, life in these hills followed a rhythm so steady that days seemed stitched together like a single cloth. The land was demanding but steady. Men rose early to tend to cornfields and hogs, while women stretched their work across kitchens, looms, and gardens. Horses drew wagons along rutted paths that cut through woods dense with oak and hickory. Children walked barefoot to the schoolhouse in nearly every season, carrying lunch tins dented by years of use. There was hardship, yes, but the people of this valley leaned into the consolation of faith as though it were the last and most certain harvest. At the heart of it all stood St. Matthew's, a modest wooden church painted white, its steeple modest but visible from most farms within 10 miles. The building smelled of pine boards, beeswax, and candle smoke. Its pews bore the polish of countless hands. Here every Sunday the valley gathered, not only to pray but to tether themselves to one another. The church was more than worship. It was fellowship. It was news. It was the anchor of their identities in a world that often forgot places like these existed. The parishioners were a tapestry of familiar faces. Mr. and Mrs. Fletcher, older now, their hands cracked from decades of working soil. Young Clara Ellis, always with a hymn book pressed against her chest. The Chandler boys, who fidgeted in their pew until their father's stern glance stilled them. Each family had their role, and in the way of small communities, everyone's story touched someone else's. The lives of these men and women were ordinary, yet to the narrator they carried weight, for within ordinariness lay the deepest currents of meaning. The priest, Father O'Malley, was a man of Irish descent, his voice low and unhurried, with eyes that carried both kindness and weariness. He had been here long enough to bury grandparents and baptize grandchildren, to see young men leave for city jobs or return wounded from accidents on the railroad. He preached less about hellfire and more about endurance, about carrying one another through the roughness of existence. When he lifted the cup of holy water each Sunday, murmuring the blessing, it was not ritual alone. It was a reminder that in this far valley, they were seen. They were remembered by something beyond themselves. The year 1912 bore with it little novelty to the Ozarks. The talk of the Titanic sinking was a far-off event. News carried weeks later in crumpled newspapers. The lives of the people here remained untouched by such grandeur and tragedy. Their focus was nearer: planting, mending fences, keeping the river from swallowing fields when it swelled. And always the rhythm of the church, the small but profound certainty that each Sunday they would gather, kneel and stand in unison, voices rising in hymns that echoed through rafters. It is within this routine, so steady and unbroken, that the first tremors of something extraordinary began. No one marked it as unusual at first. Faith often asks of its people small gestures of devotion, kneeling a little longer, fasting when not required, or taking holy water not merely to bless the forehead, but to sip from the hand. But when the first parishioner lifted the chalice to his lips after Mass and drank deeply, others followed without hesitation. Some thought it odd, others saw only a sign of renewed piety. Father O'Malley did not stop them, though his brow furrowed slightly as he set aside the vessel. It was a moment that passed quickly, absorbed into the greater tide of Sunday. Yet the narrator insists, such moments are the hinges on which history swings. In the hush of that valley, surrounded by hills that had stood for centuries, 20 souls marked themselves with a choice that would ripple far beyond the cedar pews of St. Matthew's. They returned home that evening with faces serene, their chores attended, their families settled. Nothing seemed changed. But the hills keep their silence well, and silence can hold secrets as large as thunder. The week unfolded with its usual cadence. Smoke curled from chimneys in the cool dawn. Wagons rattled along dirt tracks. Children recited their lessons by lantern light. Saturday came with its preparations for Sunday service, polishing boots, ironing dresses, baking pies that would cool by windowsills. And yet, though no one voiced it openly, a faint undercurrent had begun. Neighbors noticed how those 20 spoke in quieter tones, how their eyes carried a look not quite like before, as if they were already gazing towards something distant. Unseen, Sunday morning returned as it always did, with the sound of bells echoing through the hollow. Families walked and rode, gathering at the church once more, pews filled with familiar faces, except as the service began, 20 were missing. Their absence was like a gap in a woven cloth, not easily ignored. At first, explanations flowed easily. Illness, a wedding, a journey to kin in another county. But as Father O'Malley raised his voice in prayer, the silence where their voices should have been pressed on the congregation like a weight. No one yet knew that the valley had been altered, that its story would forever carry the mystery of those who vanished. For now there was only a question that hung unspoken in the rafters. Where had they gone and why had they not returned? The Sunday before their absence, the air in the valley had carried a strange stillness, the kind of quiet that slips over the hills after a heavy rain, when even the birds hold back their songs, and the earth seems to breathe slower. That morning the parishioners filed into St. Matthew's in their usual order, families sitting in their accustomed pews, widows near the aisle, children fidgeting under the watchful gaze of parents. Yet beneath the normal hum of greetings and the shuffle of boots on wooden planks, there lingered something less ordinary. It was not loud enough to be named, only faint enough to be felt, like a draught slipping through a closed door. Father O'Malley conducted the Mass as he always did, with a voice both measured and soothing, his Irish cadence softened by years among the Ozark hills. The readings were from the Gospel of John, words of water and spirit, of thirst and fulfillment. He preached on endurance, on how rivers carve stone not by force but by persistence, and how faith likewise shapes the soul not in moments of grandeur but in steady devotion. The congregation listened with bowed heads, some murmuring assent, others letting the words drift over them like the smoke of candles. When it came time for the blessing, Father O'Malley lifted the vessel of holy water. It was a silver basin, simple in form, dented from years of use, filled that morning with water drawn from the well behind the rectory. He blessed it as he always did, his words rising and falling, his hand forming the sign of the cross above its surface. The congregation watched with the reverence of routine. No one expected what would follow. The first to act was Elias Fletcher, the eldest of the Fletcher clan, his hands as weathered as the land itself. Instead of dipping his fingers for a customary blessing, he cupped both hands, drew water up and drank deeply. His eyes closed as though tasting something more than water, his shoulders straightening as if a burden had lifted. A murmur rippled across the pews. Then, as though some silent signal had passed among them, others rose. Mrs. Fletcher, the Ellis girl, two of the Chandler boys. One by one they approached the basin, each drinking with a solemnity that gave the act the weight of ritual. By the end, 20 had partaken, their faces calm, their gazes steady. Father O'Malley watched with a furrowed brow. He said nothing, only lowered the basin once the last had stepped back. His instinct wrestled with his reason. On the one hand, this was not forbidden, though unusual. Holy water had long been used for blessing, rarely for consumption. On the other hand, he could not deny the fervor in their expressions, as if they had discovered something he himself had overlooked. He dismissed them with the final benediction, his words carrying a faint tremor. The congregation spilled out into the sunlight, their chatter rising as families discussed crops, weather, and chores awaiting them at home. But within that ordinary talk, eyes turned often to the 20 who had drunk from the basin. Some whispered of piety, others of strangeness. Clara Ellis walked with her hymn book pressed close, her lips moving as though in prayer, though no words could be heard. Elias Fletcher moved with a younger man's stride, though his years were many. The Chandler boys laughed more freely than usual, as though unburdened of some secret. Neighbors noted these things but said little. In small communities, curiosity often wrestles with politeness, and few dared to suggest aloud that something unusual was stirring. Yet those who had drunk returned home differently. Their meals were eaten with quiet reflection, their chores performed with care but without complaint. That evening, lamps glowed later than usual in their houses, shadows moving long into the night, as if conversations or meditations kept them wakeful. The priest, alone in his rectory, lingered over his Bible longer than he had in years. His eyes returned again and again to passages of water, of wells of thirst quenched, of baptism into something larger. A disquiet stirred in him. He knew his flock, every habit and quirk, and never had he seen them move with such united strangeness. He wondered if he should speak to them, but the thought slipped away with the assurance that perhaps it was a passing gesture of devotion, a moment born of impulse. He blew out his candle, whispering a prayer that all would be steady again come the next Sunday. But the hills do not let go of oddities so easily. The week carried small signs that only in hindsight would seem remarkable. At the Fletcher farm, Elias was seen staring long at the river, as though listening to it speak. Clara Ellis wrote long entries in a notebook she rarely let out of sight, her face lit by some inward flame. The Chandler boys wandered farther from their chores, walking into the woods as if tracing a path known only to them. Others among the 20 grew quieter, their gazes fixed on horizons beyond the valley's boundaries. Their neighbors noticed but did not question, for in 1912 curiosity often stayed locked behind courtesy. By Saturday, as families prepared for the Sabbath, the undercurrent of unease had spread. Mothers pressed children to behave, fathers polished their boots, women set pies to cool on windowsills, but behind every routine act lay the echo of the week before. The image of friends and neighbors drinking the holy water as though it contained a promise beyond words. And so, as dawn broke on the next Sunday, the bells of St. Matthew's rang through the valley, their sound clear against the hills. Families made their way along the dirt paths, wagon wheels creaking, horses snorting in the cool morning air. The church door swung open, and pews filled once more. But as the service began, heads turned and silence deepened, for 20 familiar faces were missing. Their absence was more than numerical. It was a wound in the fabric of the congregation. For the first time in memory, the church felt half empty, and though no one spoke it aloud, the same thought pulsed through every heart. Something had happened, and the valley would never be the same. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of St. Matthew's, scattering across the polished wood of the pews. The congregation shifted uneasily, aware of what was missing before Father O'Malley spoke a single word. It was not the usual trickle of absentees, the sick, the weary, the travellers bound for kin in another county. No, this was larger, heavier. 20 pews held gaps where familiar faces should have been. The Fletcher's bench, normally crowded with children and grandchildren, sat bare. The Chandler boys' restless energy was absent. Clara Ellis's hymn book, always clutched against her chest, had not entered the building. A silence lingered that even the sound of bells could not fill. Father O'Malley began Mass as he always did, his voice steady, though the tremor in his hands betrayed him. He did not remark on the empty places, though he saw them as clearly as everyone else. The prayers rose thinner and less full, the chorus weakened by absence. The hymns echoed through the rafters, their strength diminished, carrying a hollow tone. The air itself seemed altered, as though the missing voices had been more than sound. They had been a weight, a binding force now torn away. After the benediction, no one rushed out the doors. Instead, small groups formed in the churchyard, their talk hushed, their eyes searching the faces of one another for answers. At first, the assumptions were generous. Perhaps the Fletchers had gone to visit their daughter in Springfield. Perhaps the Chandlers were tending to illness. Perhaps Clara Ellis had traveled to kinfolk with short notice. But as name after name was spoken and the number grew, the explanations thinned. 20 was not coincidence. 20 was not ordinary. "Strange thing," muttered Henry McLean, adjusting his hat against the sun. "All at once, and no word sent." His wife Ruth nodded, her eyes darting toward the woods as though they held the answer. Others exchanged similar glances, the silence punctuated by nervous laughter. No one wanted to name the thought pressing at them, that those who had drunk from the holy water were the very ones missing. By late afternoon, word had spread across the valley. Neighbors hitched wagons and rode out to the homes of the missing. At the Fletcher place, the front door stood open, curtains stirring in the breeze. A pot of beans sat cooling on the stove, untouched, as though supper had been abandoned mid-bite. The barn held its tools in order, but the animals were restless, as if left too long without familiar hands. At the Ellis homestead, Clara's notebook lay on her desk, pages filled with hurried writing, though her parents could not bring themselves to read beyond the first lines. At the Chandler farm, chores were half complete. Laundry strung but not taken down, a hoe left in the soil, the impression of small boots still pressed into the dirt path leading to the woods. Sheriff Alden Caldwell was summoned by dusk. A man of plain speech and steady habits, he was not given to wild talk or fancy. He arrived with his deputy, examined each homestead and scratched his head with a calloused hand. "No signs of struggle," he said to the small crowd that gathered at each house. No tracks of wagons leaving. They didn't pack, neither. It's as if they walked out the door and never looked back. The valley settled into a restless night. Lamps burned later than usual. Doors were barred with an urgency not often seen in a place where neighbors trusted neighbors. Mothers drew children close. Fathers checked rifles, though no danger was visible. The hills seemed to press tighter around them, the silence of the woods growing heavier. The absence of the 20 hung in every room, every field, every whispered prayer. Father O'Malley knelt in the church long after dark, the only light the flicker of a single candle. He replayed the image of the 20 drinking from the basin, their faces serene, their eyes fixed as though beholding something beyond him. His prayers faltered. For the first time in years, he did not know what words to say. Was this a test of faith, a trial, or had he failed to see a warning, a deviation from the path he should have guided? He bowed his head against the altar rail, his lips moving in silence, but no comfort came. The following morning, the search deepened. Neighbors gathered in small groups, venturing farther into the valley. They combed the fields, the riverbank, the trails leading into the forest. They called the names of the missing until their voices grew hoarse, but only the echo of their own cries returned. No broken branches marked a hurried flight. No discarded belongings suggested distress. The earth bore no wounds to reveal their passing. The only sign left behind was the stillness, an uncanny quiet as if the land itself was keeping a secret. By midweek, the valley had divided into 2 camps. Some clung to practical explanations, that the 20 had gone together to found a new settlement, or that they had been misled by some wanderer with promises of opportunity. Others, quieter but no less convinced, believed it was divine. "The Lord called them," one whispered in the post office line, "called them straight to his side." This explanation brought little comfort, for if the Lord had called them, why had he not called all? Why had he left the rest behind? Children listened to their parents' hushed talk and carried it into their play, reenacting the missing in games that ended with sudden vanishings. The elders frowned at such things, but did not correct them, for even in the games lay the truth. The story had already become larger than fact. It was no longer just about who was gone. It was about what their absence meant. In time, suspicion began to stir. Some whispered that Father O'Malley had encouraged the act, that he had known more than he told. Others eyed the well behind the rectory, muttering about poisoned water, about hidden rituals. The sheriff dismissed such talk as foolishness, but he could not quiet the growing unease. 20 people do not vanish without cause, and cause demands to be found. And so the valley, once so steady in its rhythm, now pulsed with a restless beat. Fields were tended, meals were cooked, wagons rattled along dirt roads, but every act was touched by the shadow of those who had not returned. The missing 20 had become more present in their absence than they ever were in their daily lives. And as the days slipped by without answer, the valley braced itself, for no one could shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. By the end of the first week, the unease had hardened into determination. A valley such as this could abide hardship, failed crops, illness, storms that tore through fences, but it could not abide uncertainty. And so, on a clear morning, men gathered at St. Matthew's Yard with lanterns, dogs, and rifles, their boots scuffed with resolve. Women packed baskets of food and water for them, their hands moving quickly, their eyes avoiding one another's. Children watched from a distance, hushed by the gravity of it all. The sheriff stood at the front, broad-shouldered, his voice steady, though the set of his jaw betrayed tension. He divided them into parties, each assigned to a quadrant of the valley. The Fletcher homestead, the Chandler farm, the caves along the river, the woods that thickened as the land rose. The first stop was the homes already glanced at, but now to be scoured with intent. At the Fletcher place, the men entered with hats in hand, respectful as though stepping into a sanctuary. The kitchen bore its silence stubbornly, the pot of beans still on the stove, a loaf of bread hardening on the counter. A quilt lay half sewn in the parlor, the needle rusting in mid-stitch. Upstairs, beds were made, clothes folded neatly, shoes lined against the wall. It was not abandonment born of panic, but of choice. The absence felt deliberate, though no note, no farewell, no trace of intent was left behind. At the Ellis home, Clara's notebook was at last opened. Its pages were filled with neat script, her hand steady. She had copied passages from Scripture, lines about water, about journeys, about being chosen. Interspersed among them were words of her own. The true well awaits. We will drink until thirst is no more. We go to the passage unseen by those who remain. The sheriff frowned over the words, his thumb running across the paper. This isn't a runaway, he muttered. This is something else. The schoolteacher, Miss Lydia Grant, who had come along at his request, leaned over his shoulder. She was a woman of 30, sharp-eyed, with a memory that stored every sermon, every town meeting, every tale passed down by the elders. She whispered, "It reads like preparation." The men exchanged uneasy glances, but none spoke further. The Chandler farm revealed little new. The laundry hung limp on the line, stiff now in the sun, the hoe still resting where it had struck the soil. In the barn, the horses stamped nervously, unbrushed and unfed. The footprints that trailed toward the woods were old now, softened by wind and weather, but still visible. 2 pairs of smaller boots, 1 set of larger, all walking side by side. The trail led to the tree line, and then vanished into the forest floor where pine needles swallowed detail. Meanwhile, another party combed the caves along the river. They carried lanterns into the damp darkness, voices echoing as they called out names. The air was cool, the stone dripping with water that fell like the ticking of a clock. No sign of habitation, no marks of fire or tools. Only bats stirred overhead, startled by the intrusion. The men emerged with dirt on their hands, their eyes narrowed with frustration. The caves held silence, nothing more. Dogs were brought in, hounds trained to follow scent. They sniffed at clothing, at bedding, at the very pews where the missing had once sat. Their noses to the ground, they pulled eagerly into the woods, tails wagging, but time had blurred the trail. The animals circled, whined, then led in directions that split apart, some toward the river, some deeper into the hills. No single path united them, as though the 20 had dispersed into the land itself. Evenings were filled with weary return. Lanterns swung as men trudged back to the churchyard, their faces shadowed with defeat. Women pressed food into their hands, but few ate with appetite. Children listened at doorways as their parents whispered over the day's findings. And always the talk circled back to the same points. The food left uneaten, the chores abandoned mid-task, the footprints that ended too soon, the notebook with its cryptic words. By the second week, the search spread wider. Neighbors from adjoining counties arrived to help, bringing horses and wagons, adding more eyes to the effort. The river was dragged in places, though no bodies surfaced. Hillsides were combed, cabins checked, paths beaten flat with searching feet. Still nothing. It was as though the 20 had stepped into another world and closed the door behind them. At night, the valley grew restless. Some said they heard voices in the distance, chants carried on the wind from the woods. Others claimed to see lights flickering near the river, not lanterns, but a pale, wavering glow. Dreams were reported too, uncanny in their similarity. Men and women spoke of walking toward water, of drinking deeply, of a peace that followed. The sheriff dismissed such tales as the fruit of tired minds, but the schoolteacher recorded them carefully in her notebook. "When so many dream alike," she said quietly, "it is not coincidence." Father O'Malley bore the brunt of the community's unease. Some came to him for comfort, others with accusations. "You let them drink," one man hissed in the churchyard. I watched and said nothing. The priest, shoulders heavy, did not argue. He too wondered what he had allowed, what he had overlooked. At night he prayed longer, but the silence of heaven pressed back at him, offering no answer. By the month's end, the valley had searched every hollow, every trail, every cave they could reach. No trace was found, no explanation secured. The land had swallowed 20 souls whole, and all that remained were empty houses and unanswered questions. And yet beneath the weariness, beneath the fear, there grew something else. A suspicion that the missing had not been taken by force, but had gone willingly. For what reason, no one could yet say. Sheriff Alden Caldwell was a man built for clarity. In his 30 years of service, his work had been simple, if not easy. A drunken brawl at the mill, a stolen hog, the occasional runaway boy who always returned within a week. He believed in evidence you could hold in your hand, in tracks that told a story in the dirt, in the weight of facts that did not shift under suspicion. Yet now, as he sat at his desk in the cramped office on Main Street, his thick fingers drumming against the wood, he found himself staring at 20 open files, each containing nothing but names, ages, and the faintest traces of routine lives cut short by vanishing. The papers seemed to mock him, as if absence itself had become a crime. Across from him sat Miss Lydia Grant, the schoolteacher. She had come not by appointment, but by insistence, walking into the office with a stack of notebooks bound in twine. She was not a woman easily ignored. Her dark hair was pinned neatly, her spectacles catching the lamplight, her posture straight with a kind of natural authority. In the classroom, she had tamed boys who threw stones at windows and girls who whispered gossip into lessons. Now she turned that same composure toward the sheriff. "You are searching the wrong way," she said plainly, laying the notebooks on his desk. "You are looking for tracks in the dirt, but the tracks you need are, in their words, in what they left behind." Caldwell frowned, shifting the stub of a pencil between his fingers. "Words don't tell me where they went. A track in the woods will. A dog's nose will. Lantern light in a cave will. Perhaps," she said, untying the twine and opening a notebook to Clara Ellis's copied passages. "But tell me, Sheriff, how many times in your career have 20 people disappeared on the same day without trace? Do you really think they simply wandered off together like cattle? Or is it possible," she paused, letting the weight of her words fall, "that they planned it?" Her voice, calm yet steady, unsettled him. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "Planned what? To vanish into the hills without telling kin? To leave behind food on the stove, laundry on the line? That ain't planning. That's madness. Madness or conviction," she replied. Her finger traced Clara's handwriting. "Look here, the true well awaits. The passage unseen by those who remain. It is not a diary. It is a declaration." She closed the notebook and fixed him with her gaze. "They thought they were going somewhere. Somewhere we cannot yet see." The sheriff rubbed his chin, his calloused thumb dragging along his jaw. Conviction was a word he respected, but also feared. A man convinced could do things no sensible man would. He sighed heavily. "Even if you're right, Miss Grant, I'm still bound to find them. I got husbands looking for wives, mothers for sons. Words don't give me a trail." She smiled faintly, not out of amusement but of patience. "Then let us make a trail of words. You gather facts. I'll gather voices. Between us, perhaps we will find what was hidden." And so began their uneasy partnership. The lawman and the schoolteacher, two figures not often seen in the same sphere, but now bound by necessity. While Caldwell kept searching the fields and woods with his deputies, Miss Grant moved through the valley with her notebooks, asking questions, writing testimonies, collecting fragments of memory before they could fade. She spoke with Ruth Fletcher, who recalled Elias standing at the river for hours, his lips moving in silent prayer. She spoke with the Chandler's cousin, who swore the boys had been whispering hymns not taught in church. She listened to the Ellis parents, who admitted Clara had spoken of a journey, but dismissed it as youthful fancy. Piece by piece the words formed a mosaic, not one of sudden flight but of gradual preparation, a slow gathering of belief like rain filling a cistern. Meanwhile, Caldwell pressed the search harder. He questioned peddlers on the road, asked passing rail workers if they had seen travelers in groups. He checked abandoned cabins, sent men to patrol the river at night. But each time he returned, his hat heavy in his hands, his answer was the same: no sign, no trace, no trail. Their paths converged in the evenings, when Miss Grant would bring her notes to the sheriff's desk. Together, by the light of oil lamps, they compared what she had gathered with what he had found. Slowly a pattern began to emerge. The 20 who had vanished were not random. They were connected by small threads: shared pews in church, hushed conversations in corners, late-night walks seen by neighbors. They had formed, unnoticed by most, a circle within the parish bound by something more than fellowship. "What do you make of it?" Caldwell asked one night, his eyes scanning her tidy notes. "I make of it," she said carefully, "that they believe themselves chosen. Not stolen, not taken, but chosen. For what, I cannot yet say." The sheriff grunted, leaning back. "Chosen or not, they're still gone. And I've got 20 families wanting answers." She met his gaze, her expression steady. "Then we keep looking. But we must look not only at where they might have gone, but at what they were seeking. If we find the belief, we may find the people." Outside, the valley lay hushed under the weight of summer nights, the cicadas droning, the river whispering in its slow course. Within the little office, the sheriff and the schoolteacher bent their heads over notebooks and maps, their alliance forming not by choice but by necessity. And though they did not yet know it, Their work would carry them deeper than either expected, into places where fact and faith intertwined, and where answers, if they came at all, would blur the line between reason and mystery. The valley itself seemed to hold its breath, as if watching, as if waiting, as if the hills knew something that had not yet been spoken aloud. The valley was never a place of great commotion. Nights were quiet, interrupted only by the hum of cicadas or the low bark of a farm dog, warning off a prowling coyote. But in the weeks following the disappearance, the calm had grown uncanny. Every whisper carried weight. Every shadow seemed to lean in closer. Rumors spread faster than wagons on the road, and before long, the search for 20 parishioners became entangled with the shaping of stories. Stories that would define what the community thought it had seen, even if no proof could ever be nailed down. Miss Grant, with her meticulous notebooks, began to write these accounts as though she were a historian preserving them for some future reckoning. Each voice she recorded trembled with a mixture of fear, awe, and conviction. And as she read them aloud to Sheriff Caldwell in the evenings, even the lawman found himself shifting in his chair, uneasy at what the words suggested. The first came from a widow named Margaret Hale, who lived near the river's bend. She claimed that 2 nights after the 20 vanished, she had risen from bed to fetch water and looked out her window. Across the darkened field, she swore she saw a procession of lights, as if lanterns were moving silently in a long line toward the water. But there was no sound, she whispered to Miss Grant, clutching her hands. Not a footstep, not a voice. Just light, moving as if carried by hands invisible. When she ran to wake her son, the lights had vanished. Another testimony came from a boy of 12, Thomas Riley, whose father worked the Chandler land. He told of hearing singing near the woods one night, faint at first but growing clearer. Voices weaving in harmony with a hymn he did not recognize. It wasn't English, the boy said, his eyes wide. It sounded like words from the Bible, but not the ones we know. His father scolded him for listening to nonsense, but Miss Grant recorded every syllable the boy attempted to hum, noting the melody with care. Then there were the dreams. At first they were mentioned only in passing, half apologies from wives who woke unsettled, husbands who admitted to tossing in the night. But soon it became undeniable. A pattern had formed. Dozens of people scattered across the valley confessed to dreams of water. They dreamed of standing at a well, of lowering a cup and drinking until their thirst was quenched. Some dreamed of following a river into darkness, others of stepping into a lake and finding no bottom beneath their feet, yet no fear either, only peace. When Miss Grant compared the details, she found similarities too precise to dismiss. Mass delusion, Sheriff Caldwell said one evening as they reviewed her notes. Folks work hard, sleep light, talk too much. Minds start playing tricks. And yet, Miss Grant countered, tapping her pencil against the notebook, they dream the same dream, use the same words. Would you call that mere coincidence? How many times have you and I ever dreamed the same thing? He had no answer. He only rubbed his temples and muttered, dreams don't leave footprints. But footprints were found, though not the kind Caldwell wanted. Near the riverbank, a search party discovered a hymn book, its pages damp but intact, lodged between rocks where the current had nearly carried it away. Inside, in a hand identified as Elias Fletcher's, a passage was underlined again and again. Whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. Tucked between the pages was a slip of paper with a scrawled note. The hour is near. Do not fear the crossing. The finding spread quickly, whispered from mouth to ear until it reached every cabin and farmstead. Some clutched the discovery as proof of holiness, that the 20 had gone not into death, but into the arms of God, called across some unseen threshold. Others muttered of cults and heresy, of madness growing within the church walls. A few, quieter still, feared the explanation least spoken, that they had walked into the river together, carried away by current and conviction. Yet no bodies had surfaced, and the water, relentless but not merciless, would surely have returned them if that were true. By the 3rd week, division had set in like rot in timber. Families argued at supper tables. Some stopped attending Mass, their faith too shaken to sit in pews where 20 had once prayed. Others clung tighter, filling the silence with louder hymns as though sound alone could drive away the shadow. Father O'Malley moved through it all like a man carrying a secret weight. His sermons grew shorter, his eyes weary, and more than once Miss Grant caught him staring at the basin of holy water, as if it were an enemy he did not know how to fight. One night, as the sheriff and the schoolteacher sat together in his office, Miss Grant set down her pencil and looked at him squarely. These accounts, dreams, lights, singing, they may not be facts in your sense of the word, but they are truths to those who hold them. And sometimes, Sheriff, truths shape the world more than facts ever could. Caldwell sighed, the lamplight casting deep lines across his face. I don't want truths. I want answers. And if we keep following lights in the woods and songs in dreams, I reckon we'll end up as lost as the 20. Miss Grant closed her notebook, her expression unreadable. Perhaps. Or perhaps that is the only way to find them. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the distant cry of an owl through the night air. Outside, the valley slept uneasily, the dreams of water spreading from house to house, uninvited yet unshakable, and somewhere in the hills or the river, or perhaps beyond both. The fate of the missing 20 lingered, waiting to be uncovered, or never to be known. By midsummer, the Ozark Valley was no longer a place of quiet unity. The disappearance of 20 neighbors had carved a wound that would not close, and in the space of that wound grew divisions sharper than any plow through soil. The missing were no longer merely absent. They had become symbols, each family and each household shaping their meaning according to faith, fear, or suspicion. On one side stood those who insisted it was divine. They gathered after church, voices hushed but firm, and spoke of the vanished as the chosen. They pointed to the hymn book pulled from the river, to Clara Ellis's cryptic writings, to the shared dreams that had swept through the valley like an invisible tide. "The Lord took them," whispered Ruth Fletcher, her voice breaking with equal measures of sorrow and conviction. "They drank his water, and he gave them rest. We should envy, not mourn." Such words carried comfort to some, but to others they sounded like madness. Opposing them were the skeptics, farmers and mothers who could not abide mystery where practical explanation should stand. "Rapture don't leave bread on the table and boots by the door," argued Henry McLean at the general store, slamming his fist against the counter. "This is man's doing, not God's. They were led astray by who I don't yet know, but mark me, it was no miracle. It was a trick." These skeptics looked with new suspicion at Father O'Malley, their eyes narrowing when he passed. A few muttered that his sermons had grown too soft, too strange, too full of water and not enough of fire. Whispers thickened. Had he allowed a heresy to take root right under his roof? Between the two extremes lay the uncertain, the majority of the valley, caught between grief and bewilderment. They attended Mass, but their hymns lacked strength. They bowed their heads at grace, but their thoughts wandered. They lit lamps later at night, their hands clutching their children close. They could not bring themselves to believe the vanished were saints, yet neither could they dismiss the unease that clung to their absence like a shadow. The sheriff and Miss Grant watched the fracture widen. Caldwell, ever practical, muttered that division was worse than silence. "A valley split can't mend itself easy," he warned one evening, pouring coffee black as tar into a chipped mug. "Neighbors stopping to look sideways at one another, friends questioning friends. That'll rot a place faster than drought." Miss Grant, with her steady hand, continued her notes. She marked not just testimonies of lights and dreams, but arguments overheard, glances exchanged, lines drawn where once there had been none. "It is history in the making," she said quietly, "though I do not know if the valley will be proud of it when told years hence." Suspicion grew heavy around the priest. Some parishioners accused him openly. "You blessed that water," one man spat after service, blocking the church steps. "You let them drink, and you said nothing. If harm came of it, the fault is yours." Father O'Malley stood in silence, his face pale, his hands folded tight. He did not defend himself, which only fueled further whispers. In private to Miss Grant he confessed, "I saw their faces that day. They looked beyond me as though I were already absent. What could I have said to stop them? Would they have listened?" His voice trembled, not with anger but with sorrow. And Miss Grant for the first time saw the weight he carried, heavier than any public accusation. As the weeks passed, tension seeped into the daily rhythm of work. Neighbors who once traded tools now kept to their own fields. At the mill, talk turned sour, men dividing themselves according to which explanation they favored. The storekeeper, who once greeted all with equal warmth, now found himself keeping separate ledgers, conscious of who stood where in the growing rift. Even the children mirrored their parents' divisions, forming groups in the schoolyard chanting taunts, "Chosen!" on one side, "Fools!" on the other. Miss Grant, distressed, tried to still them, but knew the roots of the division ran deeper than childhood play. Yet through all the fracture, one question bound them together. Where were the 20? Whether sainted, deceived, or lost, their absence pressed harder with each passing week. And with the arrival of August heat, when the river ran low and the air grew heavy, strange reports began to multiply. More claimed to see lights near the woods, or to hear the faint hum of voices across the water at night. A farmer swore he found a shoe in the reeds, though when shown the families could not agree if it belonged to anyone missing. Another insisted he saw a figure at dusk, a woman in a white dress walking along the ridge. Yet when he ran to call her name, the ridge stood empty. Caldwell dismissed most of these reports, yet even he grew restless. "Too many eyes seeing the same thing for it to be nothing," he admitted reluctantly. Miss Grant, pen scratching across the page, noted, "Perhaps the 20 are nearer than we think, though in a way we do not yet understand." The valley, once united by faith and fellowship, now held its breath against itself. Some prayed louder, some doubted more fiercely, and some simply waited, eyes on the hills, ears bent toward the river. The mystery of the vanished was no longer just a question of where they had gone, but of what their absence revealed about those who remained. And in that question lay the beginning of something larger, a reckoning that neither the sheriff nor the schoolteacher could yet name, but which they both felt was drawing nearer with each passing day. The river had always been the valley's backbone, a steady course of water that carved the land, fed the fields, and sang against the stones in a language older than any settlement. Children had learned to swim in its shallows, farmers watered livestock at its bends, and Sunday picnics were often laid on its banks. But after the 20 vanished, the river took on another presence. It was no longer only life-giving. It had become watchful. Folks walking near its edge found themselves pausing, as if the current itself were carrying secrets, and many began to whisper that the answers, if any existed, must lie in those waters. Sheriff Caldwell had resisted searching the river again after the fruitless draggings earlier that summer, but when new reports surfaced, he relented. Dave Farmer claimed to have found boot prints leading down to the reeds, too fresh to belong to anyone missing, but strange enough to raise suspicion. Another swore he had seen ripples that spread in circles without fish to make them, as though something unseen had moved through. With the valley restless, Caldwell gathered a new search party, lanterns in hand, ropes and poles ready, and led them down to the banks. Miss Grant, refusing to stay behind, walked with them, her notebook pressed against her side, skirts brushing against the tall grass. The first hours were ordinary. The men spread out, calling names into the dusk, their voices carrying over the water. The river answered only with its usual murmur. Yet before long, peculiar discoveries appeared. Near a cluster of sycamores, they found a child's shoe half buried in mud. Its leather was worn but not rotted, as if it had been set there only recently. No one could agree whose it was. Some said it belonged to one of the Chandler boys. Others were less certain. Farther down, tucked into a rock crevice, Miss Grant spotted a hymnal page, damp and curling at the edges, with a single verse underlined in a shaky hand. "They shall hunger no more, neither thirst any more. For the Lamb shall lead them unto living fountains of waters." She read it aloud, and though the words were scripture, they landed on the ears of the men like a warning. Night fell quickly along the river, the shadows of the trees growing long, lanterns casting yellow orbs against the dark water. It was then that the dogs, usually steady, began to whine and pull against their leashes. They sniffed the air, then tugged toward the caves that opened along the limestone cliffs. These caves had been searched before, yet the dogs were insistent, their barks echoing against the rock. Caldwell led a group inside, lanterns lifted high. The air was damp, cool, carrying the metallic tang of stone. They walked deeper, voices echoing until the cave narrowed into a passage where the ceiling dipped low. On the wall, illuminated by trembling light, streaks of charcoal could be seen, lines and arcs drawn crudely by hand. The drawings were simple but unmistakable, circles of figures standing in rows, a wavy line below them that could only be water, and above them what appeared to be a door, a rectangle open at the top. Miss Grant sketched them into her notebook, her hand steady even as her heart raced. "This is not idle graffiti," she whispered. "This was meant as record." Caldwell touched the markings with his fingers, then shook his head. "Could have been made years ago. Could have been boys fooling around." But his voice lacked conviction. The men with him shifted uneasily, their eyes darting toward the dark. The air seemed heavier here, not just from damp stone but from something less tangible, as though the cave itself remembered those who had walked through. The search party left the cave unsettled, the drawings fresh in their minds. They pressed farther along the river, some swearing they heard faint singing carried by the current, so soft it could have been mistaken for wind. One man raised his lantern toward the opposite bank and claimed to see figures moving in the trees, yet when others turned, the shapes were gone. Caldwell barked at them to stay steady, but even he found his eyes lingering on the shifting shadows. By midnight they returned to town, weary and shaken. They had not found bodies nor living souls, but they had gathered fragments, objects, writings, markings that only deepened the mystery. Around kitchen tables that night, the discoveries spread quickly. The shoe, the hymnal page, the charcoal drawings. Each family interpreted them differently. To some they were signs of holiness, proof that the missing were enacting a divine passage. To others they were proof of deception, of a cult forming under the guise of faith. A few muttered that darker forces were at play, though they rarely spoke such things aloud. Father O'Malley, when shown Miss Grant's sketches of the cave drawings, went pale. He pressed his hands together, whispering that the imagery resembled not only water but baptism, not only a door but deliverance. Yet he refused to speak of it from the pulpit, fearful of fanning flames already too wild. As the weeks wore on, the river became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Families walked its banks at dawn, some to search, others to simply stand and stare, listening to the current as though it might reveal where their loved ones had gone. Lights were seen again, pale glows drifting along the water at night, and singing was reported by more than one household, though never loud enough to be sure, never close enough to confirm. And always the sheriff and the schoolteacher worked together, his facts and her words intertwining, though neither satisfied. "The river gives us fragments," Caldwell muttered one evening, his hat resting in his lap. "But fragments don't make a body, don't make the truth." Miss Grant closed her notebook gently. "Perhaps the truth is not whole. Perhaps it comes only in fragments, and it is for us to piece them." Outside, the river kept its course, steady and unbroken, carrying with it both life and mystery. And in the murmurs of the current, the valley began to believe that if the 20 had left a trace of themselves, it would be found not in the fields nor the homes, but at the river's edge, where earth and water met and secrets seemed to flow onward into eternity. The Ellis house, though empty for many weeks, still smelled faintly of soap and wood smoke when Miss Grant returned to it with Sheriff Caldwell one hot August afternoon. The shutters rattled faintly against their hinges, the sound sharp against the stillness of the day. Dust had begun to settle on the furniture, but the home had not yet surrendered to abandonment. The table still bore the impression of family life, plates stacked neatly, a pitcher left half filled with water that had long since grown stale. Clara's desk, however, remained the center of curiosity. Her notebook had already been pored over, her words studied and whispered about across the valley, but it was Miss Grant's instinct that there was more yet hidden in the house. She moved slowly through the small parlor, her hand brushing along the shelf where a row of books leaned. Most were hymnals or weathered novels, but her fingers paused at a heavy family Bible, its leather cracked, its edges frayed by decades of use. Something in the way it leaned drew her attention. She lifted it carefully, the spine creaking, and opened it on the table. Out fell a folded piece of paper, yellowed but not brittle, hidden between the Book of Revelation and a set of handwritten genealogical notes. Sheriff Caldwell straightened, his eyes narrowing. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, pulling his spectacles from his pocket. Miss Grant smoothed the paper open with deliberate care. The handwriting was hurried but strong. It was Clara's. The words were not scripture, though they borrowed its cadence. "We prepare not for death, but for passage. The water is the key, the door unseen. We are called beyond the hills, to where thirst is ended and all voices rise together. Leave behind fear, for those who remain cannot follow. They will not understand." The sheriff exhaled sharply through his nose. "Passage, door called. That's the same nonsense she was scribbling before. Sounds more like preaching than writing." Miss Grant studied the lines closely, her lips pressed tight. No, Sheriff. Not preaching, instruction. This was not left behind by accident. It was meant to be found, Caldwell grunted. If it was meant to be found, why hide it in a Bible where it'd sit weeks without eyes on it? Perhaps, Miss Grant said slowly, because she or they wanted it to be found not by their families who might destroy it in grief, but by someone searching for truth. By us. The sheriff shook his head, though his frown betrayed thought rather than dismissal. Truth. This ain't truth. It's riddles. If they wanted truth, they'd have written, "We're headed west," or "You'll find us by the caves." Something plain. But plain words, she countered, would have betrayed them too soon. This is deliberate obscurity meant for those who look deeper. Word of the letter spread quickly once it left the Ellis house. That evening, a crowd gathered outside the churchyard, demanding to hear what had been found. Caldwell resisted at first, but under pressure Miss Grant read the letter aloud. Gasps followed, then murmurs rising into argument. Some clutched their hands together, tears in their eyes, proclaiming that the words confirmed their belief. The 20 had been chosen, taken into holy passage beyond human reach. Others grew angry, accusing the priest again, or muttering that Clara had led the young and impressionable into madness. A few voices even accused the sheriff and schoolteacher of hiding more than they revealed, of shaping the words to their own ends. The division grew sharper still. Families of the missing leaned into faith with desperation, calling the letter a gift from God. Neighbors whose kin were untouched grew colder, muttering that no divine calling would split a valley in half. The Bible and its tucked-away note became an object of pilgrimage. Some came to kneel before it in prayer, others to argue that it was evidence of a deception yet to be uncovered. Father O'Malley, when shown the page, pressed it against his forehead with trembling hands before placing it gently back between the scriptures. He said little afterward, only that the community must not let anger undo what remained of their fellowship. But at night, Miss Grant and Sheriff Caldwell sat again in the dim glow of lamplight, the letter between them. Passage, Miss Grant whispered, reading the lines again. Not death, passage, the door unseen. She tapped her pencil against the words. And the water, the key. Caldwell leaned back heavily, his chair creaking. I don't like the sound of it. Sounds like they plan to walk straight into that river, every last one of them. And yet, she replied softly, no bodies have returned. The river keeps what it takes, but not forever. Something else is at work here. The sheriff rubbed his chin, staring at the paper, as though it might change under his gaze. Then the question is, did they walk in as fools, or were they led in by someone with a hand on their backs? Miss Grant closed the Bible slowly, her face solemn. Or, she said, her voice just above a whisper, did they walk in believing it was not an end at all but a beginning? Outside the cicadas droned, the hills holding their silence as tightly as ever. The valley had gained a letter, a voice from the vanished, but instead of solving the mystery, it had only deepened it. The families clutched at it like a rope, while the rest of the community pulled away in suspicion. And in the tension between those two poles, the valley strained, a place once bound by faith now divided by the echo of words written in secret. The weeks slipped into months, and still the 20 did not return. The Ozark hills held their silence, as though the earth itself had swallowed the missing and chosen not to give them back. Summer waned, the fields turning brittle under August heat, and the valley seemed to grow quieter with each passing day. The mystery had shifted from an immediate wound to a slow, lingering ache, an ache that seeped into every home, every conversation, every look exchanged between neighbors. Farms began to show the strain first. The Fletchers' fields, once among the most prosperous, lay half-tended, weeds rising where corn should have stood tall. With Elias gone, his sons gone too, the land had no strong hands left to guide it. The Ellis home grew wild at the edges, the garden unweeded, the fences sagging. At the Chandler farm, the animals grew thin, sold off piecemeal by distant relatives who came only when necessity demanded. It was as though the land itself reflected the loss, the valley scarred not only in spirit, but in soil. For those who remained, the silence was a heavier burden than the absence itself. Neighbors spoke less freely. Laughter that once rang across fence lines now sounded brittle, forced, quickly stifled. In the store, conversations began with weather, but inevitably turned to whispers of the missing. Every creek in the woods, Every flicker of light near the river at night was seized upon as a possible sign, though nothing tangible ever came. The search parties dwindled, their energy sapped by futility, until only the sheriff and Miss Grant pursued the matter with persistence, their nightly reviews of notes and scraps becoming almost ritual. The families of the missing bore the greatest weight. Some clung to faith with desperate tenacity, keeping lamps lit in their windows, as though the 20 might find their way back. Others turned inward, sealing their grief behind locked doors, refusing visits from neighbors who once shared supper at their tables. A few began to resent not only the vanished, but also those who still believed in their sanctity. If they were chosen, one widow muttered bitterly at the well, then the Lord has a cruel way of choosing, for he left the rest of us with nothing but questions. Father O'Malley carried his own burden silently. His sermons grew fewer, shorter and less confident. Once a figure of steadiness, he now seemed fragile. His voice faltering at the pulpit, his eyes shadowed. More than one parishioner noticed him gazing toward the holy water basin, with a look not of reverence but of dread, as though it had become the source of his torment. He confessed to Miss Grant in private that each night he prayed for a sign, for clarity, yet none came. "Perhaps," he said softly, "I failed them by not forbidding the act. Perhaps I failed all of you." But when she urged him to speak openly of his doubts, he shook his head. "If I voice them aloud, the last thread holding this valley together will snap." The sheriff, pragmatic as ever, struggled against the slow decay of morale. He still organized searches, though fewer joined him now. He still took statements, though most added nothing new. More than once he muttered that a disappearance without evidence was worse than a crime, for at least a crime offered proof. Miss Grant, recording faithfully each development, sensed that the mystery itself was becoming larger than the people it had consumed. The story was reshaping the valley, pressing itself into memory whether resolution ever came or not. Children, growing restless under the hush that blanketed the adults, wove the story into their games. They played the crossing in the fields, lining up 20 stones to mark the vanished, chanting verses they half remembered from overheard talk. Parents scolded them harshly, forbidding such games, but the children played them anyway, their laughter thin but persistent, as though instinctively keeping alive the thing the adults feared most: remembrance. As September cooled the air, a heaviness settled into the community. Families once united by church suppers and barn raisings now avoided one another. Some stopped attending Mass altogether, convinced the church itself was tainted. Others came more fervently, their prayers louder, their eyes searching heaven as though demanding answers. When the letter in Clara's Bible was brought up, arguments flared. Was it proof of sanctity or evidence of dangerous delusion? The valley's identity, once anchored in shared faith and neighborly trust, now seemed to unravel thread by thread. The sheriff and Miss Grant found themselves isolated by their work. Some accused them of stirring unrest by pursuing clues better left buried. Others leaned on them too heavily, desperate for resolution they could not provide. Yet still they pressed on. They pored over scraps, revisited homesteads, questioned travelers, mapped the valley inch by inch, and though each day ended with no answers, neither could abandon the search. One night, after hours bent over maps, the sheriff leaned back in his chair, eyes weary. "What if we never find them, Miss Grant? What if the only thing we leave behind is silence?" She closed her notebook slowly, her hand resting on it. "Then the silence itself becomes the story, and generations will ask not only what happened to the 20, but what it did to us. That may be the greater mystery, the ones who vanished or the ones who remained." Her words lingered in the dim lamplight, heavy as the valley's own hush. Outside, the hills stood quiet, the river whispering its eternal murmur. The 20 had vanished, but their absence had become louder than their presence ever was. And as the valley bent beneath the weight of silence, no one could yet see how far that silence would reach, or what truths, if any, it still concealed. Autumn deepened in the Ozarks, the hills turning to russet and gold, the air sharp with the scent of wood smoke. The valley's routines carried on, harvests gathered, barns filled, fences mended, but beneath it all pulsed the same quiet fracture. The 20 remained gone, and though their names were still spoken, their faces had begun to drift into the haze of memory. Yet one man carried them heavier than all others: Father O'Malley. He had grown gaunt in those months, his cheeks hollowing, his once steady hands trembling as he lifted the chalice each Sunday. His sermons had shrunk to little more than readings, his voice low and hoarse as though each word cost him dearly. Parishioners noticed, of course. Some whispered that guilt had broken him, others that he harbored knowledge he would not share. A few accused him outright, murmuring that a shepherd who could not protect his flock had no business at the altar. Through it all he bore the weight in silence. Until the evening he summoned Sheriff Caldwell and Miss Grant to the rectory. They arrived just after sunset. The rectory's lamp glowed faintly, casting long shadows on the whitewashed walls. Father O'Malley sat at his desk, his Bible open before him but untouched, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. He rose to greet them, but his movements were slow as though he carried a burden far heavier than his years. "I cannot keep this any longer," he said, gesturing for them to sit. His voice cracked, but there was resolve in it. "You've asked me for months if I knew more. The truth is I did. I saw it growing among them and I turned away." Miss Grant leaned forward, her pencil poised but still. "What did you see, Father?" He clasped his hands, staring at them as though afraid to lift his eyes. A circle within the parish. It began quietly. Small gatherings after Mass, hushed conversations in corners, scriptures exchanged in tones too fervent for ordinary devotion. Elias Fletcher, Clara Ellis, even young Chandler, they were at the center. They spoke of water not only as blessing but as passage. They believed the well, the river, the very holy water in this church was more than symbol. They said it was the door. Caldwell's jaw tightened. "And you let it go on?" O'Malley's eyes finally rose, glistening. What was I to do? To accuse them of heresy in front of their families, to scatter suspicion in a valley already clinging to faith as its last rope. I told myself it was harmless, the way folks sometimes see more in Scripture than is written. I thought it would fade. But it did not fade, it grew. And then came that Sunday when they drank, one after the other as though rehearsed. I knew then I had failed them. Miss Grant's pencil scratched against the page, her hand steady even as her heart quickened. "Did they ever tell you where this belief came from?" "Who led it?" The priest shook his head slowly. "They never named a leader. They spoke as if it were shared, as if the call rose among them rather than from any one voice. But Elias," he paused, his mouth tightening, "Elias had the authority of age, of presence. When he stared into that basin of water, it was as though he saw something none of us could. If any bore the weight of leading, it was him." The sheriff shifted in his chair, his hand balling into a fist. "So you knew there was a sect forming in your pews, and you said nothing until now. Father, do you realize what that's done? The valley's near tearing itself apart with guesswork." O'Malley bowed his head, his shoulders sagging. "I know, each day I kept silent. The burden grew. But fear held me. Fear that if I spoke, I would make truth of what was only whisper. Fear that if I condemned them, I would drive them deeper into secrecy. And when they vanished, I told myself it was too late, that no word of mine could call them back. But now," he spread his hands helplessly, "now the silence is worse than the truth." Miss Grant's voice softened. "You believe they went willingly, then? Not stolen, not taken." "Yes," he whispered, "willingly, with conviction that I could not share. And that is what haunts me most, that they looked upon the water and saw salvation, while I looked and saw only reflection." For a long while, the room was quiet, save for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. The sheriff sat back heavily, the lines on his face deepening. Miss Grant closed her notebook gently, her gaze fixed on the weary priest. "What would you have us do with this confession, Father?" Caldwell asked at last. O'Malley's eyes lifted, filled with sorrow. "Tell it if you must. Hide it if you must. But know this, the 20 believed they were called, and I failed to turn them back. Whether they walked into the river or the woods or something beyond, I do not know. But their faith was real to them. And perhaps that is all the answer we will ever be given." When they left the rectory, the night had deepened. The stars hung low and sharp above the dark line of the hills. Sheriff Caldwell walked in silence, his boots heavy on the dirt road. Miss Grant kept pace beside him, the priest's words echoing in her mind. "He held it back too long," Caldwell muttered finally. "Perhaps," she replied, "or perhaps he held it as long as he could bear. Sometimes truth does not come in time to prevent the wound, only to name it after the bleeding has already begun." The sheriff grunted but said no more. They walked on, the hush of the valley pressing in around them, as though the land itself had listened to the priest's confession, and would carry it now in its own silence. The next Sunday, fewer still came to Mass, and those who did watched Father O'Malley closely, as if expecting more words to break loose from him. Words that might finally pierce the silence that bound them all. But when he mounted the pulpit, he spoke only of waiting, of faith in the unseen, his voice trembling but steady enough to carry through the rafters. And though no one said it aloud, all who listened knew that something in the valley had shifted again. The priest's confession had not solved the mystery. It had only deepened it, laying bare that the line between devotion and departure was thinner than anyone had dared to admit. Years have a way of folding themselves over grief, not erasing it but softening its edges, until sorrow becomes less a wound and more a scar. By the time the first decade had passed since the 20 parishioners vanished, the valley had already begun to speak of them, not as neighbors lost, but as figures of story. They were called simply the 20, their names rarely recited in full anymore, their lives compressed into a single tale retold at gatherings, whispered at firesides, passed down to children too young to remember the empty pews for themselves. The farms they left behind told their own story. The Fletcher land, once proud and tended by strong hands, grew over into pasture, cattle from neighboring farms wandering freely across its boundaries. The Ellis home stood long abandoned, its shutters rattling in storms, Clara's writing desk left to gather dust until the boards of the house began to sag. The Chandler place, too, fell quiet, the barn leaning with age until one spring storm pushed it half-collapsed. In time, these homesteads became markers not of prosperity, but of absence, landmarks whispered about with a mix of reverence and unease. For those who had been children in 1912, the vanished became a kind of myth stitched into their upbringing. Some remembered the hush in their parents' voices, the way mothers lit lamps longer at night, the way fathers stopped speaking at the mention of names once so familiar. As adults, they carried the tale outward, into Springfield, into St. Louis, into rail towns and army camps, telling it as one tells a local legend, a story both personal and distant. The 20 were remembered not as ordinary farmers and mothers, but as chosen or as deceived, depending on the teller. The truth, too complex to grasp, bent itself into versions that fit the needs of those who spoke it. Sheriff Caldwell grew old in his post. He never solved the mystery, never found tracks that led to bodies or survivors, never recovered evidence to satisfy the law. Yet the work of searching had marked him. In his later years, when younger deputies teased him for still carrying maps of the valley's rivers and caves, he only shook his head. Some cases don't close, he told them, because they're not meant to. You don't solve them, you just carry them. He retired with a reputation for steadiness, but those who knew him well could see the shadow of the 20 still in his eyes. Miss Lydia Grant, the schoolteacher, fared differently. She became not only a teacher, but the valley's chronicler, her notebooks swelling into stacks that filled her modest home. She kept every testimony, every fragment, every scrap of rumor, as though one day it might form a whole. She never married, though suitors came and went, and some said it was because she could not surrender her time to anyone but the story she carried. Children she taught grew up to speak of her as stern but fair, with eyes that seemed to see not just who you were, but who you might become. In her later years, she would read aloud the tale of the 20 at harvest festivals, her voice calm, her words steady. And though no one asked her if she believed they were chosen or deceived, her telling always held a reverence that silenced quarrels. Father O'Malley lived longest of all, though he bore his guilt to the end. He never again spoke directly of that Sunday when 20 drank from the basin, but he kept the Bible with Clara's letter inside, its leather binding worn thin by his hands. Parishioners said he prayed longer than most, often late into the night when the church lay dark. Some claimed he wept in those prayers, though none ever entered to see. When he died, the Bible was found on his desk, the letter still folded within, its words no clearer but no less haunting than the day it was discovered. By then, the 20 had passed fully into legend. The younger generation spoke of them in half-mythical tones, some saying they walked into the river and vanished beneath the current, others that they passed through an unseen door, as the letter had promised, into some new world. A few darker versions claimed they had been led astray by madness, lured into the caves never to return. Whatever the version, the truth mattered less than the telling, and the telling mattered most of all. The valley endured, as valleys do. Children were born, Fields were ploughed, barns were raised, and the rhythm of life continued its steady beat. But beneath that rhythm ran another pulse, a quiet thread of memory, the story of the 20. The Sunday that began like any other and ended in silence. The weeks of searching, the months of suspicion, the years of unanswered questions. And so the legacy of the vanished was not only their disappearance, but the way the valley learned to live with the absence. They became both wound and folklore, both warning and wonder. Their faces faded from photographs, but their names lingered in whispers. The silence they left behind became a presence of its own, shaping the way neighbors trusted one another, the way sermons were preached, the way dreams were interpreted when water ran low or storms shook the river's banks. To the outside world, they were little more than a curiosity, a strange tale from a forgotten hollow. But to those who lived in the valley, they were never forgotten. They were the reminder that the ordinary could tilt, that the familiar could dissolve into mystery, that even in the quietest places on earth, the ground could open beneath your feet and leave only questions in its wake. Time rolled forward, carrying the valley with it. Seasons came and went, fields ploughed, seeds sown, children born, old men buried. But the story of the 20 never faded. It changed shape, softened at its edges, stretched into legend, yet always returned when the river swelled or the church bells rang in the mist of a Sunday morning. For the valley, the vanished were not merely gone. They had become a permanent echo in the hills, a reminder that the ordinary can dissolve into the unknowable without warning. By the 1930s, new families had settled in some of the abandoned farms. They rebuilt barns, mended fences, brought laughter back into houses once heavy with silence. Yet even as hammers rang and fresh boards were nailed into place, neighbors would lower their voices when passing along the stories of who had lived there before. Children born decades after the vanishing grew up playing in meadows, where wildflowers now grew over what had once been neat rows of corn. They were told never to wander too close to the river at dusk, though none could quite explain why. "That's where the water keeps its secrets," old men would mutter, spitting into the dirt. The caves along the limestone cliffs too drew whispers. Hunters passing near claimed they still saw faint markings on the walls, the charcoal drawings of circles and doors. Some swore new lines appeared over time, though no hand was ever caught making them. Young boys dared one another to venture inside, their lanterns shaking as they tried to laugh off their fear. More than once a child returned pale and trembling, insisting he heard singing deep within, a hymn he could not quite place. The Bible with Clara's letter remained in the church long after Father O'Malley's death. His successor kept it locked in a chest, unwilling to destroy it, unwilling to display it. It became a relic of sorts, though not a holy one. Some said it should be preserved as proof of faith, others that it should be buried to rid the valley of its curse. Yet there it remained, page and ink, a fragile doorway into the past that none could cross. Sheriff Caldwell passed on before the war, his badge buried with him, his name spoken with respect. Miss Grant outlived him, her notebook stacked higher each year, her handwriting neat to the last. In her final years, she taught children not only arithmetic and letters, but also memory. "We are more than crops and barns," she would tell them. "We are our stories, and the story of the 20 is ours, whether we like it or not." When she died, her papers filled boxes and some were lost, but enough remained to ensure the tale never slipped entirely into silence. By mid-century, the valley had changed. Automobiles rolled along roads where wagons once rattled, telephones connected homes once cut off, electricity hummed where lamps had burned. Yet in the evenings, when crickets filled the air and the river whispered in its eternal course, the story rose again. At kitchen tables, on porches, at gatherings after funerals or weddings, someone would mention the 20 and the hush would fall. Were they chosen? Were they deceived? Did they walk willingly into the water, or into some unseen passage? No answer was ever agreed upon, but the asking itself became part of the valley's fabric. Visitors passing through sometimes heard the story, scoffed and moved on, dismissing it as folklore. But those who stayed long enough to live through the valley's winters, to hear the river groan under ice, to see the fog roll low through the hollows, found themselves less certain. There was something about the land, about the silence of the hills that seemed to hold its own counsel. And so the echo of the 20 lingered, not as spectres, not as saints, but as an enduring question. Their absence became part of the valley's presence, shaping the way generations spoke of faith, of mystery, of the line between belief and madness. The hills kept their secret as hills do, and the river carried its murmur into each new year, unchanged and unbroken. On quiet nights, when the moonlight shimmered against the current and the trees bent low in the wind, some swore they could still hear it, faint voices rising, a hymn carried on air and water, too soft to follow, too haunting to forget. And though no one could say where the 20 had gone, all agreed on one truth, that the valley itself remembered and would go on remembering, long after those who had lived through it were gone. The 20 had vanished, but the echo of their passage endured, stitched forever into the hills of Missouri, into the hush of the Ozark nights, into the hearts of those who told their story again and again, never certain of the ending, never certain if an ending had ever come at all.